Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this webinar hosted by the Foreign Policy Centre and Leiden University. My name is Alice Copland. I'm the Policy and Parliamentary Affairs Manager at the Foreign Policy Centre, and I'll be chairing this discussion looking at the first 100 days of President Trump's second term in the White House. To help us unpack what's been a sort of unprecedented 100 days and examine how things might move forward, we're joined by three fantastic speakers who will each cover different aspects of US domestic and foreign policy. They are Dr. Andrew Gawthorpe, who is a lecturer at Leiden University and an expert on US foreign policy. He founded the podcast and newsletter America Explained and was previously a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. Dr. Courtney Radsch is the director of the Centre for Journalism and Liberty at the Open Markets Institute, where she produces and oversees research on AI, new market media structures, and information power. Prashant Rao is the senior editor at Semaphore and was previously international editor at The Atlantic and deputy Europe business editor at the New York Times. President Trump was inaugurated on the 20th of January 2025, and prior to his election, there had long been discussion that a second term could look vastly different to the first, with a more organised operation and loyal teams surrounding the president. However, the pace and scale of change since January has been unprecedented and had global impacts. President Trump has completely altered US policy towards Ukraine, threatened the annexation of Greenland and Canada, dismantled US aid, and introduced globally disruptive tariffs, reversing them for the majority of countries shortly after. These policy changes have created a wholesale shift in the way that the US is viewed within a global multilateral system and economy. Governments and institutions around the world have been grappling with how to respond to the unpredictable and unconstrained approach of the White House, and the UK government is no different, with Prime Minister Keir Starmer towing a fine line in his diplomatic relationship with Trump and also the EU, and UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves visiting Washington just last week to try and carve out a trade deal. In the week that marks 100 days in office for President Trump, this webinar is an opportunity to take stock on where we are at this stage, discuss prospects for the future and how the international community, including the UK government, will respond. So I'll hand over quickly to our speakers, but just before then, we will be moving on to a participant Q&A, and there's a question box in this webinar, so please do share any questions you have throughout, and I'll get back to them when we move to that part of the session. And there was an opportunity to submit questions in advance, so I'll also be drawing on some of those points throughout. But yeah, I'm conscious that we have a lot to cover in our 1 hour time slot. So I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Andrew. The volume of executive orders and announcements coming from the White House can make it difficult to track policy developments and impacts. I wondered, Andrew, if you could provide us with an update on domestic developments in the US and perhaps touch on some of those questions regarding constitutional issues that are being raised at this stage. Thank you.
Yeah, well, hi, Alice. It's great to be here today, and thanks a lot for organizing this event and also to my fellow panelists and everyone in the audience. For me, one of the most interesting questions of this first 100 days has been to what extent can or will Trump be constrained by the people and the institutions around him? So it's clear that this administration is going to be much more radical than Trump's first administration. That time around, there was frequently this impression that he was stymied either by the courts or by Congress or by officials in the White House or the wider federal bureaucracy. This time around, though, Trump has really he's like launched a campaign to try to undermine and attempt to cower these different potential sources of opposition. So we've seen that he's appointed much more energetic and all people throughout the bureaucracy. He's waging this kind of unprecedented campaign against the judiciary, which is very concerning. And he's also making a really concerted effort to silence his critics in Congress. And in many respects, this campaign seems to be working. Indeed, it's taking on a lot of very frightening characteristics. So we've all read about Elon Musk and about Doge's attacks on the federal bureaucracy. The administration is actually now preparing new measures to allow it to hire and fire at will more civil servants and kind of appoint loyal officials throughout the bureaucracy. We've seen at the same time some, I think, really disturbing attacks on the rule of law and on constitutional protections. So the administration is really putting forward this viewpoint of almost untrammeled executive power where the president just gets to do whatever he wants, basically. And, already the administration is flouting or is very close to flouting a direct order from the Supreme Court. And actually, just over the weekend, the FBI arrested a Wisconsin state judge who it says was obstructing immigration enforcement. So a really big escalation in this campaign against the judiciary. I think one thing that can also be kind of hard to appreciate unless you talk to people in DC is that there's just this kind of climate of fear that exists in so many US political institutions now that, particularly like Trump supporters all day, every day are spending their time putting pressure, sending death threats, trying to intimidate people that might step out of line, whether they be federal officials or they be, congressional Republicans or somebody else. So there's this kind of background drumbeat of menace that Trump does nothing really to try to stop or to discourage. But so that's all the negative, and it's a lot negative. I don't want to downplay the negative. I think it's also important not to succumb to this narrative that Trump is all powerful, that Trump cannot be stopped. That is what Trump wants his opponents to believe. He wants to create this kind of shock and awe impression that his power is unlimited and that there's not really much that can be done to oppose him. But in fact, we have seen in the first 100 days that this is not entirely true. There are a few glimmers of a few pieces of evidence that it's been possible to force Trump to restrain himself a little bit. Now, the most directly obvious of those is, of course, his tariff policy. We did see that Trump seemed somewhat sensitive to bad economic news. It's clear that the reaction in the markets, and particularly the bond market, played a big role in him winding back some of that tariff policy. What remains in place is still tremendously destructive and will cause more economic harm, but there was at least some response to external stimuli there. I think we've also seen that political pressure from congressional Republicans and from the public, particularly this state Supreme Court election that took place in Wisconsin, showed that political pressure could force Trump to somehow limit the power of Elon Musk, to encourage Musk to transition out of the administration and to rein in some of the damage that he was doing. Although again, Musk has done tremendous damage, and what will happen in the future is still somewhat unclear. So in both of these cases, with tariffs and Musk, we see, examples of tremendous damage, but also that there was some sensitivity to economic and political limits from the administration. Now, this is by no means a message of optimism. I think that, particularly with the example of the economy, this is something where there's a very direct and measurable, actually quantifiable impact from policy that the administration took notice of and then reined in its actions a little bit. But in a lot of policy areas, there isn't this kind of direct feedback. There isn't, something analogous to the markets that acts to kind of discipline and discourage the administration. And particularly with these attacks on the Constitution and the rule of law that we're seeing from the administration, it can sometimes be very hard to galvanize opposition around those. The threats can seem very vague. Sorry, that's my time. The threats can seem very vague to a lot of people. It can be difficult to build a coalition to oppose those things. So this leaves Democrats with a big problem about how to respond, and other opponents of Trump a big problem about strategy in responding to this. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And yeah, what you were kind of mentioning with that environment in Washington is something that had actually been touched on at the Foreign Policy Centre's Media Freedom Forum conference, where there was this sort of concept of even anticipatory obedience from the media, but also other actors in the space who are just feeling that kind of chilling effect of what's going on. But I think also the points you touched on about where are those limits, or where can those sort of constraining factors be, is something that's important to consider amongst the sort of the wider environment at this time. And yeah, I think where you were able to touch on Elon Musk there was great, and it links with what Courtney will kind of be able to talk about. If I can turn to Courtney, sort of underpinning all of the changes has been a sort of a real change in how the administration is functioning and which actors are behind some of the decisions that are being made by President Trump. In parallel with this, the role of the media in promoting accountability is shifting. Could you touch on some of those themes that I know that you've been working on recently?
Sure. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I think it's a really important time to take stock of what has happened here. And I am joining you from Washington, D.C., where I can tell you that, pretty much everyone I know has been affected by what's happening here, either losing the jobs that they have or their partner has, or having to fire everyone on their teams. And it has broad repercussions, including not only economic, but the chilling impact. I think what we really are truly seeing here is the rise of authoritarianism, the demise of democratic institutions of oversight and accountability, not least of all firing the independent heads of agencies, firing the staff that works at oversight agencies. And unfortunately, the courts deciding that so far has been allowed at a couple of different agencies. So, this dismantling of the oversight functions of the American government, while simultaneously um, infiltrating the American government with unaccountable technology people, people from tech firms that many times seem to have very little qualifications, much less the security clearances and other training that they need to access government data systems. And you've probably heard about how the misnomed Department of Government Efficiency, which is neither a department, it is not governmental, and it is apparently not efficient because it keeps firing people and then having to rehire them when they discover that they do actually important work. They have infiltrated many of the systems of government. And you've probably heard how that has affected US citizens' privacy, but it could potentially affect citizens around the world, especially with access to things like the USAID database, the database of, different loans, different foreign assistance, including also IRS information, which has information on businesses. So we really have no idea how much information and data has been siphoned off by Elon Musk and his minions. But we do know that they have taken data. We also know that during this time period, Musk sold his platform Twitter/X to his AI company called XAI. And we know that AI has been implemented now throughout many of these government systems. Now, in democracies, we often decide to trade some level of inefficiency for a level of protection against government surveillance and authoritarianism. So we have typically, not allowed information from the Internal Revenue Service to be combined with Department of Homeland Security information, or maybe education. There are some levels of non-data sharing inefficiency that are allowed in exchange for our rights. And these are being dismantled. So we're using, for example, the IRS to go after immigrants. I think more broadly, we are seeing really a broad suppression of dissent and free expression, both directly and indirectly. So, the ongoing attacks on the media, the use of regulatory agencies like the FTC, our Federal Trade Commission, or the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, that are supposed to be and are statutorily independent, and being used to weaponize those against mainstream media, while also using them to intimidate tech firms like Google, Meta, et cetera, about how they might be censoring conservatives. And so this really manipulation of the facts through regulatory bodies, threatening mergers of these major media companies because of the editorial content of their news programs. We have seen the DOJ now kind of get rid of some restrictions on how they could seek or subpoena journalist records. The censorship through kind of funding investigations and administrative investigations against public media outlets like NPR and PBS. These ideas that, grants need to require the affirmation of American values. There is an effort to look at the Smithsonian, which is a collection of many different museums around town, to look at what are they promoting in terms of, American history. Are they pro-American enough? Having just gone to see an exhibit about the United States movement west and genocide of different Native American populations, this is really concerning. There's the African American Museum, which deals with our, shameful history of slavery, how we are rewriting history. And then, of course, we have AI, right? We've got all the tech aspects here. You saw the bro-oligarchy in the front row of the inauguration. We all saw that, but what does that mean? This means that we are no longer in an era where tech companies are kind of like going with the flow. They adapt their content moderation policies to reflect the priorities of the latest administration on foreign policy, or, they try to coordinate with the World Health Organization. We are now seeing the fusion of state and technological power. So we've seen platforms get rid of fact checking, get rid of content moderation, turn these, some of the wealthiest companies in the world are now turning to this idea of community notes, that somehow we as volunteers should clean up the crap on their platforms. They're now this truly Orwellian. I mean, when we've used that term for so many years, but it is Orwellian what is happening here with the doublespeak, calling the, Russian invasion of Ukraine and talking about the Ukraine invasion of Russia. Like, it's just, it becomes very difficult to resist. You have the Associated Press being kicked out of the White House for not using the term Gulf of America instead of the, more well-known Gulf of Mexico, just really from the highest levels to down to these little terms of what do we call things. But with respect to the tech firms, we now, because of AI, you have the equation of technology and artificial intelligence with national security. Anything we don't do to support the bro-oligarchy is somehow helping China. They want exemption from copyright. They want full access to data. They want lots of protections and subsidies, while we are going around telling other countries that if you seek to regulate your digital markets, if you seek to regulate content moderation, you are anti-American, you are engaging in censorship, and we're going to retaliate. So I think it's a very challenging, dangerous situation in the United States, but also around the world. So let me leave you with those lovely thoughts.
Thank you, Courtney. And I think some of the points you said there, deeply concerning but important. And I think that point of, a fusion of state and technological power that you raised is something that's emerging, but will obviously have to be contended with in this administration, but beyond. Because I think another thing that it would be good to touch on is how are these shifts broader than just this current administration, and what can't be sort of rolled back, say in 4 years' time. And I think another thing that might be interesting to discuss is, I think focusing on standards and processes and procedures that have been in place, and as you were sort of highlighting, are in place for a reason, can sometimes be seen as boring. So how are those conversations that are happening sort of in policy circles, are they translating to broader support bases where, sometimes I think coming in and being the disruptor is obviously seen as the more exciting option. But how are those kind of conversations translating? But as I said, this is a Q&A and we'll be moving to Q&A soon. So please do send in questions if you have them. They'll come into a question answer box and we can see them and pass them on to our speakers. But Prashant, I'll come to you last. We've had this kind of difficult picture of the domestic situation in the US. And I think, domestic changes obviously have a global impact. And Trump is advancing a very different foreign policy agenda, including with relation to conflict in Ukraine and in Gaza. What have the foreign policy impacts of Trump's decision-making been in the last 100 days? And what does that signal to the international community who are trying to navigate increasing uncertainty in a rapidly changing multilateral system?
So I guess a few things. I think one of the difficulties, which I think all of us are grappling with, is separating the signal from the noise, as has been the case in the first Trump administration. There's just so much that is happening that understanding sort of longer term trends is a bit difficult. So, with a degree of humility as to knowing what's going on, I feel like there are a few kind of secular trends that I think are consistent, both across the first 3 months of this administration and sort of 4 years of the prior, Trump 1.0. A few things that I've been thinking about a lot is one, understanding that trade protectionism now is a feature, not a bug, of American foreign policy, not Trump foreign policy, but American foreign policy. And Trump may be, more itinerant and sort of fast paced and kind of whipsawing with his trade policy. But frankly, the Biden administration was also, by the standards of post-war administrations, extremely protectionist, whether it be restricting access to restricting Chinese access to semiconductors, or putting 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. It was by no means a free trade administration. It made no efforts to sort of resurrect the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the IPEF, the trade deal they offered to sort of Asia-Pacific countries, was largely, it didn't really get off the ground, and the limited kind of progress it aspired to make was by no means a trade agreement. Then the other thing is that the rivalry with China is a fully bipartisan issue. There may be some, movement on the edges of the sort of foreign policy discourse of being slightly less hawkish, but there's no space for doves in the foreign policy discourse in Washington today when it comes to China. And there's no cost for being excessively harsh towards China. As frankly, Trump's 145% tariffs seem to indicate. For now, we will see once the projected price increases and sort of shelf shortages hit. But for the moment, at least, there is very little cost to being hard on China in American politics today, which is an interesting contrast to relations with Russia, which polling indicates both among politicians, but also among voters, is now a very partisan issue. There is some sign that is changing, and that Republicans are willing to put their heads above the parapet a little more to criticize Trump's rapprochement with Vladimir Putin. But for the moment, that also has become quite a partisan issue, which makes the China relationship quite stark. And that is maybe the rare sort of high-level bipartisan issue in Washington today. And then thinking about all of those trends in kind of a bigger picture context, the kind of things that have been interesting is I think there's a piece of foreign affairs a couple of weeks ago, which really captured how Trump won in 2017, released a national security strategy, which characterized the era of great power competition as having returned to American foreign policy. And Stacey Goddard in Foreign Affairs wrote a, I thought, really smart piece in which she characterized, actually, we have now moved to great power collusion, and compared what is now, global foreign policy and global geopolitics to 19th century Europe. And Trump's favored form of foreign policy being dealing with strong, ostensibly strong leaders, so Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, etc., and sort of making the world work to their designs, rather than a system of, rules, order, the kind of classic, liberal international consensus that we've talked about, ad nauseum in the past few years and its erosion. That leads to like the last thing I would want to say, which is, a former Canadian diplomat wrote a book about Indian foreign policy in the sort of early 2010s, in which he characterized Indian foreign policy as relentlessly bilateral. And I think that kind of interestingly applies to Trump today and Trump's sort of foreign policy, and that there's a very sort of limited lack of confidence in, there is a lack of confidence in multilateral institutions, whether they be NATO, the European Union, multilateral trade deals, multilateral trade agreements, USMCA, innumerable sort of sets of kind of things that he may have negotiated and others may have negotiated. I think the president currently believes that negotiation should be bilateral, that the United States typically can win those negotiations if they are bilateral. And so that bilateralism then, I think, feeds into this kind of great power collusion that Goddard wrote, I thought, quite eloquently about in Foreign Affairs.
Thank you so much, Prashant. And yeah, a number of issues I think that will be good to touch on in the Q&A. I think, this idea of, as you say, sort of American foreign policy rather than Trump foreign policy speaks to what I was, discussing with Courtney's remark, is how much of this is going to go beyond Trump in 4 years. What will this mean in terms of just broader mindset and policy shifts? And I think also, the idea of dealing with strong leaders and how is that playing out when we look at, the Trump's predicted trajectory and how he could handle the conflict with Russia and Ukraine is obviously not gone to plan. So where is that going to continue to develop? And I think also on that bilateral point, that's been a huge conversation if you think about the US-UK relationship and the US-UK-EU relationship is, where will European member states stick together as a sort of a trading bloc, or will there be an attempt to make one-off deals moving forward? But that was, yeah, an extremely helpful, if not slightly depressing overview. So thank you, Andrew, Prashant, and Courtney for sharing those insights. We'll now open to questions from the audience. There's some questions coming already, but please do keep sending them in and we'll answer them. I will take Chair's liberty to draw on some of the questions that were sent to us in advance that I think are important to touch on. And if I can come back to you, Andrew, when you were mentioning these, well, it's been mentioned throughout these kind of checks and balances, or what are different parties doing? What are the Democrats really doing at this time? Could you draw a bit more on that, and who's a potential leader? And I think also, what's the relationship right now like between a Democrat supporter base and Democrat leadership? And is there frustration with a sort of perceived lack of response to Trump's decision making in the first 100 days?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really great question. And I think it's important to start by acknowledging that the Democratic Party is in a really bad place right now. So, I mean, the election loss last year, which you can to some extent say, okay, this was a product of a global wave of inflation. Many incumbent governments fell last year. But at the same time, to not be able to, beat Donald Trump, to allow him to get a second administration. And this kind of, in a way, I think in the eyes of a lot of Americans, Trump's Republican Party has now become kind of a legitimate part of the political spectrum. And that's a big problem. And you can't, American democracy can't survive in a situation where it's just always one election loss away from this MAGA party taking power. Now, on the other hand, the Democrats are, by some measures, the most unpopular the party has ever been. So there was a poll earlier this year where just approval of the Democratic Party was the lowest it's been in a very long time, or I think perhaps the lowest it's ever been. And there's clearly a lot for the party to do to rebuild trust after its perceived poor handling of the economy, and also the perceived poor handling of Joe Biden's advanced age and kind of the problems that brought up. Now, on the other hand, Trump is in many ways his own worst enemy. I mean, the fact that he has come out the gate with this incredibly destructive economic policy, that he came out of the gate empowering Elon Musk in a way that seemed to threaten many of the welfare programs and the benefits and the federal services that many Americans actually rely on and have very high appreciation for, has caused this big wave of political backlash. And so there's this debate within the Democrats now. What do we do about this? And I think it's too early to really talk in terms of personnel, like who will be the next presidential candidate, because I think that's only going to become clear in the coming years. But there is a really big debate in the party now about two different things. And one of them is tactics and the other is message. So when it comes to tactics, you see that more kind of like older, more establishment figures like Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, is basically saying just like, hold your horses. What we really need to do is just wait for political gravity to assert itself. Donald Trump will become unpopular. His approval ratings will go down. And then that will make other people in society and other Republicans not cooperate with him and will allow us to resist this kind of incipient authoritarian takeover that Courtney talked about. Now, on the other hand, you have people within the party saying, well, hey, what if there never is another free and fair election in the United States because this authoritarian takeover is proceeding while you sit around talking about approval ratings, right? And I think that there is at the moment a great deal of frustration in, not just grassroots Democrats. And I think to characterize it that way is a bit misleading because it makes it seem like it's a party thing. I just think there's frustration among Americans who really want to see this administration opposed. Trump is not the all-powerful or popular figure that he likes us to think that he is. So there is tremendous cause for something to be done right now. And I think at the moment that there's a bit of a problem with coalescing around what something should be, right? Does it need to be a mass protest movement? Does it need to be something that plays out in the courts? what does it need to be? And I think that we will reach some kind of galvanizing moment, perhaps when it's Trump directly ignoring an order from the Supreme Court, perhaps it's something else that will force this movement to the next level, and we'll see this real renewed outpouring of activist energy. And then, yeah, just one last comment. The other part of this, the tactics part, there's also the message part as well. So, I think that the Trump administration really thinks it benefits from news cycles that are about immigration. It thinks that it's doing a great job when what's in the news every day of the week are its abuses of power against undocumented persons, for instance, or actually, in many cases, people who did have the right to remain in the US, but then the Trump administration just deported them with no due process. And I think the Trump administration really wants to focus on that because it thinks that illegal immigration, is a good issue for it. And the Democrats are debating, well, should we be focusing on the rule of law and the Constitution and these abuses, or should we be focusing on the economy? Now, what I would say is that actually a smart democratic message would combine both of these things. When you have a president who is trashing the American economy through the untrammeled and in many ways probably unconstitutional uses of presidential power, and at the same time, he's doing the same thing in other areas of national life. He's abusing the rights of other people. It should not be too difficult to demonstrate that the rule of law and democracy are kitchen table issues. These are economic issues. These are things that affect what families care about. And I think that that's what a really smart democratic message would be in the coming years.
Thank you, Andrew. That's really interesting. And Courtney, I had a different question planned for you, but I think based on what Andrew said, I do want to ask the dangerous question is, someone has asked, how likely do you think it is that Trump is going to try and rerun for president in 2028? Or, is this an example of this idea of flooding the zone and just putting these kind of wild conversations out there to distract from other issues, perhaps economic results? Yeah, if you were able to draw on that.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, I think that a lot of what happens in the coming years depends on information power, right? The ability of Americans to assign blame or understand kind of the causal chain of events for things happening, whether it's in the economy or, in their schools or whatever, is going to depend in large part upon the narrative that they believe. And right now, we have, again, this unprecedented fusion, at least unprecedented in the modern era, fusion between information, technology, power, and government power here in the United States. So, Twitter X is now essentially state-run media, right? It is reflective both in its content and its algorithmic manipulation of the government point of view, the Trump administration's point of view. You've got the cowing of many news organizations. And one of the things that the Biden administration was very successful at was actually fighting back and breaking up anti-democratic concentrations of power throughout the economy, and fighting back oligarchs. That's now a term you hear a lot of, and yet the fight against that happened under the Biden administration, but he did a very poor job of telling that story. I mean, there were some great tales. Lena Khan, the head of the FTC, showed up on Comedy Central, but like that just was not enough. We heard so much about the price of eggs in our election, and yet we never heard about why those eggs are so expensive, is because our entire food production chain that produces the chickens, the feed, the machinery, the farms is all monopolized by, not even a handful of corporations. And so I think part of the problem with the Democrats was effectively telling the story and using information to empower people. And I really wonder about the potential for that to happen in the future. The right wing here lives in a completely different mediated universe than, say, the left or centrists. And I think a big problem in this country is we only have two parties, and they're both pretty poor options at this point right now. So, the Democrats have done some things. Cory Booker stood and did that really long, speech on the floor of the House. It got pretty like minimal media attention. And like, that was great to see someone stand up. We have seen, some protests, but I think we're lacking a lot in part because neither party currently has a vision that resonates with a lot of people, right? People don't want the technofascism of the Trump administration, but they also don't want, the Democratic Party doesn't have a vision for the future, and the fact that it doesn't have a leader is very problematic. I mean, Trump was leading the Republican Party since, he was president and beyond. So, but the question about whether he will run again in 2028 is not just dependent upon him. We have rules. He has to be, put on the ballot in every state. He would have to have the backing of, the Republican Party. So it would take a lot of complicity from the establishment to allow him to run again. However, we have seen that in many other countries. And I think we really are seeing a lot of learning from Hungary, for example, which really pioneered the illiberal autocracy playbook. Think about Duterte in the Philippines. I mean, he murdered hundreds, well, had murdered hundreds or at least tens of thousands of people under the auspices of fighting drugs. He had, sadly, a lot of support of the population. So I really question people who, are going to support him. And the fact that we keep calling him and his administration conservative when there could be nothing further from the truth. They're radical. But the words, the terminology, the narratives that many in the media use here, and which, then circulate in our online environment, et cetera, are both obfuscating. They grant him a level of legitimacy that doesn't exist. And people just don't, I think also they don't care. They see Elon Musk as a really smart businessman. He, created all of these companies. They do not know that he got billions of dollars in subsidies from the government for SpaceX, for Tesla, et cetera. So, the Americans, I'm not too sure about. My concern is, are the Europeans going to stand up? Are the Brits and the, kind of big developing countries going to stand up to these threats? Or are they also going to kind of appease the authoritarian ruler that's taking over in the United States? I mean, I think we are firmly in an illiberal authoritarian dimension right now. I think we have to see whether our institutions will hold, but we know that, we might have elections, but will they be free and fair when the media is cowed, when people are scared to come out voting, and when there's literally an attempt to erase the idea of women, of minorities, of diversity, equity, inclusion, which by definition puts the white male Christian American as the default. This is, the regular, the norm, and anything else is, in relation to that norm. That is I think a pretty widespread phenomenon where, there's a lot of, I mean, Andrew Tate, I think he just got like a, private jet flight to Florida. So that is beyond just the Trump. There's this whole movement. And so we have to see, the broligarchy, the chauvinism, the nationalism, all of these are kind of part of the same dynamic that is fueling this administration.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, there was the same kind of thread that was coming through in your initial remarks, is it's a broader shifting in language and how we understand, government and what that looks like and how we talk about that and how that's then understood by the broader public. So thank you for drawing some of those points out. I mean, Courtney, you touched on it there, and Prashant, it really leads in well to the next question I had for you. Is, it's come in the questions from the audience is, how do you think the European Union or individual states should respond to US actions, whether relating to Ukraine, Gaza, tariffs? And, is it likely that states are going to be moving bilaterally, or do you think there will be a sort of a broader coalition-based response, whether through, existing structures like the European Union or in sort of broader multilateral spaces?
I mean, it's important to differentiate what they could do and what they should do. And so rather than talking about what they should do, which is, I mean, I'm not sure is like a thing I can sort of elucidate on, but in terms of what they can do, I think it's important to recognize the constraints that a lot of these actors face in the landscape, and that just the overwhelming military capabilities of the United States makes it, quite difficult for the European Union to suddenly ramp up to, be able to, for example, in Ukraine, provide the reassurance force. The Times of London reported last week that the UK is already reassessing whether it can put boots on the ground in Ukraine, because without the American backstop, they cannot be sort of necessarily secured. And so, we see innumerable examples of, whether European countries want to do things. Frankly, they have relied on the American defense backstop for, 70, 80 odd years. And that has meant that a lot of those militaries in a lot of those European countries are not capable doing the things that they would like to be doing in a place like Ukraine to the extent they would like to be doing them. The same goes with Gaza. And, a lot of it is, yes, the US has overwhelming military strength. It also has overwhelming financial strength. And the power of the dollar is by orders of magnitude more important than the power of the euro. And so when it comes to Iran, for example, maximum pressure can be enacted in a way that the European Union just cannot necessarily address, whether or not it agrees with it, right? And Gaza is the same. The World Health Organization, the World Food Program, have recently announced that they're, cutting a huge number of jobs and aid provision because of the sort of defenestration of USAID. And so the idea of what these countries should do is, I think, kind of to one side. What they can do is somewhat limited, but what we do see is, I think, they are increasingly, the U.S. accounts for, I think, 30% of all global trade, and so that means that 70% of global trade happens, in absence of the United States, and we're seeing that being somewhat reconfigured, right? Brazil's president was in Japan a couple months ago, calling for sort of LATAM Japan trade deals. The EU seems to have started moving a little bit on the sort of long discussed EU Mercosur deal with Latin America. The European Union and Beijing seem to be going through an early détente. The European Parliament and Beijing seem to be ready to relax sanctions against one another. And the EU is talking about reducing tariffs on vehicles. So I think what we're seeing is, countries, non-US countries are reevaluating their relationship with each other, because the sort of stakes and the upside scenarios have shifted, frankly. And so that doesn't mean that, everyone's going to be applying to China. We can talk about that later. Or that, suddenly, the European Union is going to be a force in the world, unlike any that we've seen before. I just think we are going to start to see subtle shifts in trade patterns and economic relations in particular, with, non-US countries, just because that is where the incentives now lie.
Thank you, Prashant. And I wondered if I could just ask you a kind of supplementary follow-up on that. Again, was a question that came in from the audience, was, this idea, and maybe Andrew, you could touch on this too, this idea of, where could there be a sort of a new defense structure? So what might Trump do around NATO? It's still not entirely clear where the position is on that, but could there be a need for a sort of European military defense group, or are there other architectures or systems that can be put in place in sort of the erosion of freedoms and this sort of real threat to what we've understood as a sort of rules-based world order?
I mean, I think we're starting to see some of that come to the fore, right? I mean, both institutionally, but also kind of at country level. Germany is sort of expanding its defense procurement really substantially, relaxing its debt brake. France has talked about using its nuclear deterrent on behalf of other countries, and again, the UK-France reassurance force. So just this kind of stuff that wasn't talked about prior to Trump coming to office. So just you see sort of. And then also, there are smaller examples, like the Ukraine contact group at NATO now isn't run by the Americans as it was until I think October. And so prior to the election in November, the Biden administration was transferring some limited responsibilities out of the United States purview with this risk in mind, I think. And you see sort of new defense architectures come up. I guess I'm just cautious about sort of putting too much stock in these new architectures, simply because the capabilities that they offer are limited, just by the nature of the fact that, by the measure not of the President Trump's threats against the Europeans, but frankly against the threat that the Russian invasion of Ukraine poses. Europeans have been underspending on defense for decades, and that doesn't get caught up in 6 months or a year, and it doesn't get caught up by sort of statements about how many fighter jets are going to donate to Ukraine and stuff. It'll take quite some time to build up both the military stockpiles, but also the industrial capacity to build up those stockpiles. And it's happening, but whether it's happening at pace and the pace that is necessary given the quite rapid withdrawal of the United States from the kind of global defense architecture I am a little skeptical.
Thanks, Prashant. Andrew, I don't know if there was any points you wanted to build on there around this idea of, building alternative defense structures and how effective that might be.
Sure. Well, I think Prashant is exactly right that if this is going to result in something that is able to make a claim to substitute for the American defense commitment to Europe, then we're talking about a project of 5 to 10 years. This isn't something that's going to happen quickly. It's going to need year after year of concerted political will. And, we often want to talk about defense spending or the defense industrial base, but it's also, frankly, a matter of the willingness of Europeans to put their lives on the line to fight Russia, if that's what this comes down to. We know that the way that Russia fights wars is through tremendous scale and large numbers of people. And is it the case that, that France would bring in conscription to defend Poland, or Spain would bring in conscription to defend the Baltics? I don't know that that's true. And also I think something that might be of interest to a lot of people in the audience is also the UK part of this as well. I think that upcoming in May, the EU UK summit is going to be really important to see if there's political will on both sides to try to get the UK more integrated into the European defense architecture. But there are barriers to that in London because of, I think, most
Andrew, we're losing you slightly, Andrew.
and that brings on the European side and some be really.
I think, Andrew, sorry, you're having some tech issues there.
I think I'm back. Yeah. I don't know what the last thing you heard was, but I'll cede the floor to whoever's next.
Oh, okay. Well, Prashant and Courtney, I know there was both points you wanted to come in there, but maybe Courtney, if there was points on national security you wanted to draw on, and then Prashant, I'll come to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think, in addition to, say, kind of the hard aspect of national security, let's remember that information warfare is a crucial part of national security and foreign policy these days. And so I also want to consider the role that, core information infrastructure and and also AI infrastructure is playing and going to continue to play in any of these discussions. So I think in addition to the very valid points that Prashant and Andrew brought up, I would add that, figuring out how to create strategically independent cloud infrastructure is going to be critical for Europe. And I hope that that will be done in a public interest sort of way, adopting a different model than the one that we currently see, which is dominated by, again, 3 American big tech companies. I think we need to look at things like satellite provision. So, Musk's company dominates low Earth orbit satellites. They have a critical role to play in Ukraine and elsewhere. That means that, that aspect of security is, again, in the hands of this mercurial billionaire who is aligned most of the time with Trump. So, I think Europe needs to think more proactively about that. And I would add, kind of as I alluded to earlier, the role that American social media, search, e-commerce platforms play in the European economy with very little, regulation. We're seeing now the DMA start to really come into force, the DSA, but like, what will the remedies actually look like? They have to include breaking up this concentration of power because it enables them to coerce Europe into operating not in its interests. And it opens them up to a lot of pressure by the United States, which is increasingly, at odds with, I think, Europe's own national interests in many ways. And so, really thinking about ensuring, continuing, of course, to have a rights-based information system, but mitigating some of the dangerous concentrations of power that American big tech firms have over both the infrastructure and the flows of information is an important part of securing foreign policy autonomy and national security in the future.
Thanks, Courtney, for drawing out those important points about how we think about future defence and beyond sort of, a hard military means, particularly in this changing environment. Prashant, I know you had some points you wanted to build on there too, so please.
Just to build on something Andrew said about sort of the note of conscription, this comes into like some real strategic choices that European governments will have to make, not just in the defense and security space, but in the broader spending space. Almost every European country has a fast aging population, which means that their pension costs will increase dramatically and their tax base is going to shrink. Their healthcare costs will increase substantially. Britain is going through this, as we speak, and every other European country. This is one of the foundational notions for why Emmanuel Macron has had a new poll ratings that have hovered at historic lows for years. Or one of the sort of limits of those has been he had to force through pensions regulation through Parliament because France, their pensions will eventually be too expensive. So how European nations balance this sudden desire to spend more in defense with what will inevitably be higher social spending based on the current construct is, I think, going to be a challenge that is not currently being debated. I mean, it wasn't being debated anyway, but this is now a new set of spending priorities that were not in the conversation. And a place like Britain, for example, which has this famous triple lock on pensions, how does that comport with defense spending that wants to increase to 2.5%, 3%?
Thanks, Prashant. And Andrew, as you mentioned, with the UK-EU summit taking place in May, I think it will be an interesting time to see where, as we're kind of going to be past that 100 days, where those conversations go and how they might move towards practical steps and what sacrifices or compromises are countries really willing to make in the face of this sort of rapidly changing landscape. But just we're kind of nearing the time that we'll have to start drawing to a close. So if you have any final questions, please put them in the box. We've kind of touched on that defense and foreign policy aspect, and someone's asked, we haven't discussed where's JD Vance's role in all of this? How do you see his position within the White House? Please, if anyone wants to take on the JD Vance question, please do. If not, maybe Courtney or Andrew, that's something you could touch on from that domestic side.
Yeah, I mean, let's remember JD Vance comes from a Silicon Valley background, right? He worked in venture capital funding in Silicon Valley. He has what appears to be pretty close relationship with many of the oligarchy that are, sitting in the front row with many of the companies there. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that because JD Vance is kind of akin to Trump in that he has, a public persona, the hillbilly elegy, the myth that he's kind of created around himself. I think, there's a movie about him. So there's some similarities, and that's why I really don't think this is all about Trump. I think that the charismatic leader matters a lot. I mean, it's a defining feature of fascism, but I think that there is kind of one that is in waiting, right? I mean, he was at that meeting and actually speaking with Zelensky. It was horrifying, but nonetheless, this very odd role for the vice president. And so far, we've seen a lot more of him than we saw, I think, of Biden's vice president, who then went on to run for president. And so, to some extent, whether it's going to be, Trump trying to, strong arm his way into a third term or simply passing the mantle to JD Vance. Let's remember this is much broader than one individual. I mean, Project 2025, everything that's happening now has very little to do with Trump. It has to do with the establishment that is behind him, putting everything in order, making sure he has the right people to put his agenda forward, the right strategy. And so, that is going to, I think, continue. And it doesn't seem like there's much distance between him and Vance, which is helpful in the Trump presidency.
Thank you, Courtney. And as we're kind of getting ready to draw to our close, I think that sort of underlines some of the points that you've discussed, throughout, is this idea of the broader shift, who is now involved in that sort of amalgamation of power beyond the traditional sort of White House administration that we'd understand, and how that mixes also with national security. Prashant, I saw you had your hand up, so if there's no point. Okay, well, Andrew, if you wanted to come in, and then please kind of bring in any other sort of final points that you would like to, just before we wrap up at past.
Yeah, sure. And just to build on what Courtney said, that indeed I think it does bring us to this question of what is it about Trump that has made his success possible? Is it a set of personal characteristics that someone else cannot replicate? And is it, a certain style and kind of a certain aesthetic of politics that he has? Or is somebody else going to be able to step in and kind of keep that MAGA coalition together? And it seems that that's what Vance really wants to do. So everything that you see him do in this White House, even what was leaked out of that Signal chat, right? The famous Signal chat that Pete Hegseth was in about the strikes on Yemen. Vance was really trying to put forward this perspective that's kind of just 100% America first, 100% MAGA, and trying to present himself as Trump's obvious ideological successor. But I do also think that when Trump eventually passes from the scene, there's not just going to be an anointment, I don't think. I think there's going to be an attempt by a number of figures within the MAGA movement, and I guess out from outside of it, although I don't rate their chances, to try to take over the Republican Party and kind of re-establish this grip that Trump has on it. But and when I think about Vance, I think about someone who is much more strategic than Donald Trump. He's much smarter than Donald Trump. He's much more yeah, I don't know, consciously cynical. I think Trump doesn't even know that he's so opportunistic and so vulgar and so horrible. But Vance knows exactly what he's doing, and he does it very strategically. And I think Vance, has a really good shot at establishing, himself as the successor. But I also wonder if he has the charisma to hold it together. So, when Trump goes, there's going to be a fight. Vance is definitely going to be one of the main people who's trying to become Trump's successor as the leader of that movement. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's some shifts and a bit of a fracturing and a battle that occurs at that moment in time.
Thanks, Andrew. Before I kind of wrap up, Prashant, I wanted to come to you finally, if there were any points you wanted to kind of touch on or really underline. I think what we've been discussing is, how our ideas of what a kind of world order looks like and how that's changing. With the very short amount of time left, if there are any points you wanted to touch on relating to that and how you see things maybe moving forward, that would be great.
Yeah, I guess I think it's useful to think about Vance, exactly the points that Courtney and Andrew have talked about, as what does he represent, not just within the movement, but also within this particular Trump administration. I think one of the kind of things that is to some degree up for debate is who speaks on behalf of this Trump administration beyond Trump himself. And so when Vance speaks on issues of policy, how much of it is, speaking on behalf of a government, and how much of it is, as Andrew, I think, correctly points out, positioning for a post-Trump future? Because, if you were to take the example, for example, of trade negotiations, which is, I would argue, the most significant thing in the global sphere that Trump has done since coming to office with these tariffs, it seemed to have taken sort of 2 weeks for Scott Bessent to become the sort of leader of the kind of trade negotiations such as they are. And Peter Navarro seems to have been sidelined, but Navarro early on was, a sort of principal figure, and was in Trump 1 as well. And so much like it was in the first Trump administration, I think it is an open question as to, one, how long do these figures survive? because he has shown a proclivity to moving through. Though apparently in this administration, he seems to have come to the conclusion that the firings in his first administration were a sign of weakness. And two, who speaks on his behalf when right now a point of fact as to whether he spoke with the Chinese leader Xi Jinping is seemingly up for debate, and that he says he did, and the Chinese say he didn't. And so, who speaks on behalf of the Trump administration is a really kind of interesting question. And that to me is kind of where Vance becomes very interesting, because when he speaks about issues to do with foreign policy, particularly my interest, it is not always clear where the Trump administration sits on these issues. And Andrew's right, that signal chat was fascinating in that context in particular, I thought.
Thank you, Prashant. And yeah, I look forward to future webinars where we're discussing the role of JD Vance and other players and how this all shapes forward. But that's us kind of at time. But I really want to say thank you so much to Courtney, Andrew, and Prashant for sharing your insights today and taking the time to discuss them with us. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we're really grateful for your time. And thank you, Andrew, and to Leiden University for co-hosting the webinar with us too. And of course, thank you to all of our participants who joined and for sharing your questions throughout. We'll cover more on US politics as part of the FPC publications, but also on our Transatlantic Periscope. Please look out for our future events and activities by signing up to our mailing list. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you again to our speakers and for joining.